Okay, I have to admit, when the Beatles album Abbey Road was released, I wasn't even born at that time. However, I'm a huge music fan and I'm also a huge fan of famous shooting locations, and on Abbey Road those two things collide quite perfectly.
Abbey Road is not only the last studio album the Beatles recorded together, it might also be one of the most important ones. 31 million copies were sold worldwide, making Abbey Road one of the most successful music records of all times. And it's not only the music that wrote pop history, also a photograph did this, the legendary album cover. It shows the four Beatles, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and John Lennon, walking across a zebra crossing in London, some of them in suits, one of them is barefoot, in the background a typical London street scenery. This album cover is so legendary that it has been recreated hundreds of times and parodied several times on other album covers. And there are also several stories and myths about this picture. Some of them are quite funny, some of them a bit scary, and some of them totally absurd.
Today it is time to have a closer look at this famous album cover. 54 years later. What happened to the crosswalk? Is it still here? What's the story behind this famous picture? And what happened to all those stories that were told about it 54 years ago? Let's find out. I would say, before we dive deeper into the story of the famous Beatles Crosswalk, let's try to find it first. I just arrived in St. John's Wood, a small living area here in London, and if you walk out of the underground, you already will see a lot of Beatles stuff. For example, some information about Abbey Road and also a small Beatles cafe. And the crosswalk should only be a few hundred meters away from here, so yeah, let's try to find it.
Yeah, and here it is, the famous Beatles Crosswalk, 54 years later. And as you can see, surprise, surprise, it's a real crosswalk on a real street with real traffic driving on it, which means it is actually a bit complicated if you want to recreate this famous picture today, and also a bit dangerous because there really is a lot of traffic here. So what I did was, when there was a minute or two when there was not so much traffic on the street, I went in the middle of the street and I took a quick picture that we can compare the scene. And this is it. This is my picture. And this is the original one, taken in the year 1969 with the Beatles on the famous zebra crossing. So what do we see on those pictures? First of all, the zebra crossing itself, the markings on the road, look a bit different today than they did 54 years ago. But I think it's not because the markings are so different. I think the Beatles picture, has been taken with a different camera setting. I think they used a wide-angle lens for that in portrait mode. So that's why this crossing looks so huge and so impressive compared to my picture, which was just taken with an iPhone and not with a wide-angle lens. However, there are a few different markings on the road, as you can see here. For example, you can see those curled lines here. You see that? This actually means that you're not allowed to park right in front of this zebra crossing, which is a rule in England, which obviously came within the past 54 years. In 1969, there were no curled lines on this road. There was just the zebra crossing and nothing else. What else do we see? We can see those houses here in the Beatles album cover on the right side of the picture. You can't see them on my picture, but they are still there, I promise. It's just because the angle and because of all the trees. There are still those round-shaped buildings on the right. But there is obviously a new building, or at least an extension on the roof. You see that on the right side? This extension obviously hasn't been here 54 years ago. There is still this wall on the right side of the footpath. In the Beatles album cover, it's a bit in the shadow, so you can't really see it, but it's still the same wall. And on the left side, we can also see a wall which also is still here 54 years later. Behind this wall, by the way, there is a quite famous building, but we will come to that later. In the background, we can see there is a bus station, meanwhile, that hasn't been here when the picture of the Beatles album cover was taken. And what is also quite funny is that the lanterns you can see here on the Beatles cover went from the right side of the road to the left side of the road. Yeah, but everything else you can see here on the picture actually looks quite the same. So if you would remove all those modern cars from this road and put some old cars, for example, a beautiful Volkswagen Beetle on the road, then it actually feels a bit like we're in a famous Beatles album cover in the year 1969.
Okay, I think now we know in detail how this famous Beatles crosswalk looks like today. Now it is time to find some information about this crosswalk and the famous picture. And I won't do that alone. I found a real Beatles expert for that.
Okay, well, I'm Richard Porter. I'm a Beatles tour guide in London. I'm also the manager of the London Beatles store. And I bring people to Abbey Road nearly every day.
Why? Why are you so fascinated about this band?
In my opinion, the best band ever. But also because of the stories of the Beatles. I love the 60s and the stories of that time as well. So, and it's kept me in a living for the last 30 years. So.
Yeah, and of course, first of all, I asked Richard the most obvious question when it comes to this famous album cover. Why the heck did the Beatles actually decide to shoot their picture on a regular zebra crossing in London? Turns out the original idea was actually a bit more spectacular.
The original title of the album was going to be Everest, but someone had the bright idea the Beatles should go to Mount Everest to shoot the album cover. And they said, well, no, or something a bit ruder than that, actually. So in the end, they just changed the title to Abbey Road, decided to take the picture on the crossing nearly outside the studio. Abbey Road Studios is just across the road. So they just came early for a recording session, took 10 minutes to do the session, and since then, I mean, millions and millions of people across Abbey Road.
Yeah, but the famous picture we all know today was not the only one that has been shot here on this famous day in 1969.
They did 6 pictures in all, 3 going one way across and 3 the other. But the ones going the other way, they weren't really trying to be in step on everything. It's always going to be going. So only 6 pictures were taken. Basically, it's the best one. They're just about in step, in procession. That's the whole idea. And it's the best of the 6.
But the fact that the picture was taken here on this street is actually quite unusual. Just like the location of Abbey Road Studios, by the way, on the other side of the street. Because St. John's Wood, the district we're in right now, is a quite special place.
Oh, St. John's Wood is, well, high-end, shall we say. Very expensive housing. I mean, the houses around here, I mean, even the apartments, they're probably a couple of £1 million each for an apartment. I hate to think what the houses are worth nowadays. You know, just down the road from this, Lord's Cricket Ground, the National Cricket Stadium, and that puts up the prices as well, I'm sure, and it's a very well-to-do area. It might seem a strange place for a recording studio in St. John's Wood. The reason is EMI wanted to build a purpose-built studio. There wasn't any land available in central London, so they bought a house with a huge back garden. The White House dates back to the 1830s. They built the studios in the back garden of the house. Wouldn't get planning permission nowadays for that, but in those days, in the 1930s when it was built, they could. That's why it's here.
Well, and at some point, before or after this famous house has been built, also the street, the crossroads, and of course the zebra crossing have been built here. However, it's not really known when exactly the zebra crossing was painted.
Well, I think if I'm right in saying the crossings date back to around the 1930s. And the flashing beacon is called a Belisha beacon, named after the guy who invented them. It's just to show there's a crossing coming up. But this particular crossing was was listed by the government. It's now got protected status. Yeah. But they couldn't list the stripes on the road. What they listed was the Belisha beacons. It's a structure. It's buildings that get listed. They can't list white stripes on the road. So they've got protected status now.
Well, and those are the facts about this famous Beatles zebra crossing. But as we all know, facts are not so much fun. More exciting are myths, stories, conspiracy theories, no matter how stupid they are. And an urban legend that is told for years is that the Beatles zebra crossing isn't at the same place anymore as it used to be 54 years ago. Richard says that it's total nonsense, and as you just have seen on my picture, he's absolutely right. But then there is also another story about this zebra crossing, and this one is a little bit creepier, and besides that, totally absurd. I don't know if you have ever heard about the Paul is dead theory. If you're too young for that, the Beatles expert will explain it to you.
Well, basically, it's a group of students in the US with nothing better to do. Had this conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney had died in a car accident in 1966. And the Beatles had got an imposter to take Paul's place in the band so their fame wouldn't be affected. But they felt guilty about doing it, so they put clues on album covers and on songs to the fact that Paul was really dead. And lots of the clues are supposedly on the album. It's Paul McCartney's funeral procession with George the Gravedigger, Ringo the Undertaker, John the Preacher. Paul is wearing an old suit and he's barefoot, how bodies are buried. He's also holding his cigarette in his right hand. People say, that's not Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney is left-handed. It must be the imposter, a guy they call William Campbell. You also say one to the alias Billy Shears. Also, you've got the Volkswagen Beetle car parked by the crossing, and the car's licence plate 281F. They said in the room it's 28IF. That's supposed to signify that Paul McCartney would have been 28 years old if he was still alive. Well, actually, he was only 27 in 1969, so the whole thing's complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah, but even though this story isn't true, it's still quite interesting, isn't it? After all, we're talking about the year 1969 here, a time when the internet hasn't even been invented. And nevertheless, the nonsense spread all over the globe, mainly via radio, by the way, as Richard says. Yeah, but even though this happened, there are actually quite rational explanations for all of the alleged clues you see on the record cover. Also, by the way, for the famous Volkswagen Beetle standing here on the left side of the road.
The guy who owned it was on holiday, and he just, he lived in the apartments the other side, and the car just happened to be there. And legally at the time, nowadays, of course, it wouldn't be legal because you can't park near a crossing nowadays. You could then. But anyway, it was there for a few days and happened to be there when the Beatles had their picture taken.
Well, and because of this myth, the Abbey Road studios and, above all, of course, the Beatles themselves, millions of people come to London today, 54 years later, to see this famous zebra crossing. This Beatles tourism, however, also has its downsides. As I mentioned in the beginning, it is not that safe to walk across the street here. And also, Richard told me that there already have been a number of serious accidents here.
Yeah, I did actually witness someone getting hit by a car here a few weeks ago. So yes, people forget about cars, and that is pedestrian crossing. And the first thing is when people stand away from the crossing in the middle of the road, taking pictures of people on the crossing with their backs to the traffic. And of course, cars come around the corner, sometimes perhaps not looking, and that's when the problems come. So there have been people hit before.
But if you don't want to miss the chance to shoot a photo recreation here, there is at least one little trick you should keep in mind.
There are traffic signals down the road in that direction. Just wait till the cars go, basically. There will be gaps. I mean, sometimes there's gaps and then you get lots of cars coming together. Just wait for the gaps, basically. And just be careful. And walk across. Don't stand in the middle of the road for too long. That's what people do. And the Beatles were walking across. That's what they were doing, trying to get the right. It looks better as well.
Richard, by the way, is a little bit surprised that there is so much hype around this road marking. There is actually a place that is much more important for the Beatles, and that's, of course, Abbey Road Studios.
I mean, people forget the Beatles were actually on the crossing only for about 10 minutes. They spent God knows how long in the studio. And some people don't even realise the studio is there. This comes to the crossing. The studios are much more important for the Beatles as far as I'm concerned. Did 90% of their recordings in the Abbey Road studios.
And even today, big music stars still record their songs in this quite unassuming building.
They do lots of music of film, like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter was all down there. We still get people, Ed Sheeran's been in the studio, Lady Gaga, people like that.
In other words, this district, this street, this studio, all of them are still a quite important place today, 54 years later. And there is actually a good chance that music history will be written here a few more times in the future.
That was my trip to London. That was my story about the famous Beatles Crosswalk. If you have learned something, if you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up. You can also hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss any upcoming video. And if you'd like to support me and my work, you can also do that on Patreon. Then you will get also exclusive stuff and new videos before everyone else. But that's it for today. Have a safe journey and see you next time.